My name is Joe Hall. I'm the Director of Community Engagement with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Through a generous donation from our local credit union, we've been able to do a lot of programming here, about 100 events a year. They're up at sfuwoodwards.ca, so please do check out all the other events that are happening. We'll be having a discussion on October the 22nd with Glenn Coulthard's new book, Red Skin, White Mask, that evening. It'll be a panel discussion. Also wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Also wanted to wish everyone celebrating Rosh Hashanah a happy and healthy New Year as well. The talk this evening is co-presented by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement, the SFU City Program, SFU Public Square, and also welcoming a new partner, the Vancouver City Planning Commission. Also wanted to thank two people who work with me here at SFU who have made this event possible. Andrea Creamer, a former visual arts student who I've been lucky enough to hire, and she's been working with me for the past year. And also Fiorella Pinelos, a co-op student in urban studies who's joined the office just in the last 2 weeks. All the proceeds from ticket sales this evening will be going to the Downtown Eastside Neighborhood House food program. They have lots of current opportunities for involvement and leadership, and you can contact them through their website and their executive director, Carol White. There will also be a reception following the event this evening in the World Arts Center, which is on the second floor, and you're all welcome to join us there as well. Here to provide some introductory remarks from the Vancity Planning Commission. Vancouver City Planning Commission asks you to join me in welcoming Commissioner Catriona Feeney.
On behalf of the Planning Commission, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event. I've been a commissioner for the past 3 years, and I'll also be the host of the Ideas Wall at the reception after tonight's event. The Planning Commission is a body of citizens appointed by the City of Vancouver Council to provide ideas and advice through the lens of the future. Many of us are here tonight, identifiable by our name tags. We are delighted to be a co-presenter of tonight's lecture and panel. Tonight's presenter, Andy Yan, is on the Planning Commission, and the panelists include a former commissioner, Peter Ladner. We are really looking forward to the lecture and panel discussion, and we look forward just as much to hearing from you during the Q&A and after the event. We've set up 2 ways to do this. You can join us at the reception after the panel discussion for refreshments and to jot down your thoughts on the Ideas Wall. Or you can send us ideas and thoughts to vcpc21@vancouver.ca or tweet your ideas at vcpcbc, #Van21. There'll be more information on how to contact us on the ideas invitation, which you can pick up on your way out, or I think some of you guys have them already. We plan to compile your ideas and publish them on our website, as well as include them in our final report. Your thoughts and ideas will help us shape further dialogues on the future of the city. Please make sure we have your email address if you'd like to keep updated. There's a sign-up sheet outside the theater doors and also downstairs at the registration table. With that, please help me in welcoming our moderator, Francis Bula.
That's great. I don't need this. This isn't really so I can tweet during my own speech. It's just my clock. So it's great to see so many familiar faces here. I feel like I'm at an angry city council public hearing or something like that. So that's wonderful. Anyway, I know we're all really looking forward to what Andy has to say tonight. I first started quoting Andy, I looked it up this afternoon, in 2001 when he was 12. Because the city was relying on him already for information about how to plan new projects in Chinatown. You were still a graduate student, I think, down in California. And he's been a really creative thinker about a lot of things since then. And I think it's important for us tonight to hear from Andy. The reason we have such a turnout tonight is this is an age of anxiety in Vancouver. We just passed through recently a period of great optimism between the Expo 86 World Fair and 2010 Olympics. Before that, actually, we'd been in decline. It was another age of anxiety. The population in Vancouver was actually going down. It dropped from 425 to 410 between 1971 and 76. And there was anxiety about a declining city. Then we boomed, and people were in kind of a good mood for quite a while. I know there was some grumbling, but generally people seemed to be pleased with the way Vancouver was becoming known as a place that could build new cities and new urbanism, and people came here and admired us. It felt like the city was doing well, and I think there was a general sense of well-being. I don't think many of you will be surprised if I say that seems to have soured. We're not in a good mood anymore. And I would say that if it hadn't been for the Olympics, it probably would have started full force with the crash and recession that started in 2007, 2008. The Olympics masked that a little. But there's a sense of unease about the way Vancouver is developing at this moment. We're not proud of every new tower that goes up anymore, the way that we used to be. I think the recession set off something worldwide that made people anxious about the sense of unfairness and inequity, with very wealthy people appearing to reap a lot of rewards and a lot of extremely poor people, and then a big swath of middle-class people just trying to make it, just trying to hang on next to them. And we see that demonstrated in Vancouver visually many times. And I think we also worry about certain things in Vancouver a bit more than other cities. What's happening to our very few older buildings and whether they're going to survive this particular wave of development. We also have celebrated in the past how diverse and how urban we are, and now I think some people are starting to feel just crowded and alienated from each other. And we're worried about, basic infrastructure. I remember in the years leading up to 2010, people were very proud of the transit system, and it was celebrated as part of the Olympics. And now, we can't seem to find any kind of a way to ensure that our transit system keeps growing with the population. So all the way through this, Andy has been somebody who has tried to get below what he calls the anecdata. One of my favorite phrases. We are a great city for telling stories about who we are that aren't always backed up by evidence. There's certain mythologies that you have to believe if you're going to live in Vancouver. It's being bought up by everyone from offshore. Used to be the Japanese. Now there's other countries involved. Young people are all leaving. They're not actually, according to statistics. Things like that. And Andy has been a person who all the way through these years has been trying to figure out what is really going on. Sometimes people love what he says, and sometimes they hate what he says. But he keeps on trying to figure out, beneath all the noise, what is really happening. So for those of you who don't know, Andy is an East Side boy. Yay. Everyone from the East Side, yay. Who has a degree from SFU, also a yay. And then went on to the University of California in Los Angeles and got his master's degree there and has been working more or less continuously since then with Bing Thom Architects, doing some really interesting work that some people might say the city planning department should be doing, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Producing interesting studies about where children are going to school in Vancouver, about who's living where, about where the million-dollar homes are in the city, and lots more things that I think you're going to see tonight. and presents it in a really accessible way, because I know that he cares deeply about how this city is evolving and changing, and he wants to be one of the people that makes it change for the better. It is changing. We can't stop the change. It's going to change one way or another, but it's informed voices like Andy's that help us figure out the best way to change. So I'll let you go ahead and tell us what the future of Vancouver is.
Well, thank you so much, Francis, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to very much thank SFU's, the Vancity Office of Community Engagement, for inviting me to speak to you tonight. I'd also like to recognize Eileen Keenan. I think where is Eileen? There she is. Eileen Keenan, part of the cohort at Bing Thom Architects that keeps me in line, and I always get a reality check with her, as well as I've noticed that there's some other members of the Bing Thom Architects team here in the back, and thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you. And really, I think I'd also like to recognize, I think Opal is from the Neighborhood House is here, also on the board of directors, and those two would love to meet up for anybody who'd like to participate in the Neighborhood House and its various wonderful activities. So, without ado, wow, Vancouver in the 21st century. We were trying to figure out what's the best title for this discussion, and we figured, hey, this is as good as any other. And in one way, the challenge of a title like this is actually as a survey of an incredibly dynamic, rich, changing city. So I am sure I have missed a lot of important topics through which I'm sure the audience member ought to and will correct me on, but then that's why the dais is here. Our rich and diverse commenters will hopefully back me up. So a lot of this is new data. A lot of this is from Statistics Canada as well as the city's open data catalog. And really, it's meant to be a view of the future, and really a view through which we are all a part of. And the challenge is, how do we remain together? So really, behind every number, one has to remember that there is a family, that there's a dream, there is a wish. And this is a photo of the first generation of Yans in Vancouver, who came in the early 20th century, and the third generation of Yans who kind of rolled by and saw the end of the 20th century, and who's interested in a lot of cake. So it's from that perspective, from that idea that behind every number is a dream and aspiration in the city of Vancouver. Here's the city. That the city itself has grown a lot in the last 30 years. And I think that as it's growing up, the question is, are we growing together? And that within this growth in the city of Vancouver, and also metropolitan Vancouver, is the kind of issues of, are we at the end of urbanization? And it's interesting that when one looks at history, and a lot of this discussion about the future, at least in my talk, is actually about history, that you come out with articles like this, that very much the statement is that there is no longer an experiment going on in Vancouver, that in our opinion, there is no better opportunities for profitable and safe investments than the present, and that the city is now being whipped up into shape and the center is being established. And then, of course, the top line is what are the opportunities today as compared to last year for profitable real estate investments. And this is coming from 1889. That very much, this arc of this conversation is that the experiment isn't over. If anything, the experiment is beginning, and that there is a lot of work ahead. And it's within this article, we see the kind of changes that very much it's about embracing Atlantic legacies, that this is a land that was heavily engaged with the British, with the Spanish, and as much as that has left a legacy of planning, we're also engaging Pacific realities, that very much the idea of Vancouver put off to the side in both the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Pacific is really one that is actually something that happens a lot, but that our questions today about Vancouver in the 21st century actually begins with this view that perhaps we all share a global destiny, that what happens when we look at not a choice between the Atlantic or the Pacific, but a question of what happens when the Pacific and the Atlantic meet. So it's in this that I try putting Vancouver in context, that very much this is a question of context and how it fits, that very much the celebrated elements of planning in Vancouver is often focused on downtown Vancouver, but then the realization that that is only part of a much larger city. That very much that downtown Vancouver is only 4% of the city of Vancouver when it comes to area and 16% of the population, but that there is a larger city that is actually 96% of its landmass and 64% of its population. And even within this idea of the city of Vancouver, it's the region. And that within this larger region is where the rest of Metro Vancouver inhabits. So the question moving forward in Vancouver in the 21st century isn't only about neighborhoods or just the city of Vancouver, but also the region. And so in this presentation, it's, I think, recognizing the accomplishments of the past, but then what happens when we change the lens? What happens when we take this perspective and twist the camera around? And that this is a view of the rest of Vancouver when you stop looking at the mountains, and you could put a drone up, that it's a perspective of the city when you take a photo shooting southeast into southeast Vancouver, and what are some of the insights that I think occur when you stop looking at just the mountains. And really, it's also about change and a change of perspective of its people. That even as late as 1986, in this painting called Vancouver 1792 by Jim Mackenzie, there was a view that Vancouver was empty, vacant land, that this is where the legendary meeting of Captain George Vancouver, Valdez, and Galiano really set forth this city and its region, and that this was land that was open for occupation and open for exploitation. But then, to the very big contrary, that there was very much human settlement for the last 10,000 years. And this isn't something that I'm going to talk too much about because it isn't a field of specialty, but really, I think what will be part of Vancouver in the 21st century is its engagements with its Aboriginal peoples and building a common destiny with those communities. That being said, I think it's important to understand some of the primal forces that have helped shape our city from day one. And what I like to do is actually look into older documents. And I like to say I was inspired by Michael Kluckner, who's right over there, and kind of just being an amateur historian compared to really his incredible work. And you should read his books. And that it's part of that, and the amazing resources that the Vancouver Archives is Sue and Heather from the archives. Hi, guys. See you next week. That very much there are these incredible resources, both digitally and on an analog level, that allows you to understand the diversity of our community. And this begins with the first, I guess, city directory. That this is a city directory from 1887. And the fact of the matter that, you go, oh, hey, wasn't the city of Vancouver founded in 1886? Well, yeah, it was founded in 1886, but unfortunately, that copy got burned. So that the only earliest copy you can find of the city directory is from 1887. And so this is a map from 1887 that's in the city directory. And it's within the city directory that you find out the really charter professions and the population. There were about 1,000 people in that early Vancouver, and wow, 19 saloons and 10 hotels. So pretty happening scene there, even back then. And it's from that cluster of the early beginnings of the hospitality industry in Vancouver, that we also find there are more, shall we say, respectable professions from tailors to boot and shoemakers to medical to doctors. That there's three and four of each profession. And then, of course, there is the barristers. You got to have, when you have a city, you got to have your lawyers, right? Even to this present day. And then, of course, the architects and the civil engineers. And, of course, the civil engineers always outnumber the architects. Story of that career. So, but I think it's from that recognition that, so given all these as the charter professions of this early city of Vancouver, we recognize that out of for 1,000 people, there were 16 real estate agents. So I want to recognize that this is very much a discussion about how this city, as well as cities up and down the west coast of Canada and the United States, was shaped by real estate. It was and still is and will be one of the forces that will shape this city. And it's from those from this initial map, you find this great collection of ads. This is a really great resource. Unfortunately, not housed at the archives, but over at the Vancouver Public Library. Sorry, I have to recognize that. But if you want a great view of Vancouver in those early years, this directory is actually published online. And you see, ads from the Bay. You see ads for lumber, spar. It's very much the image of what you view as an early Vancouver. But you also see ads that are like this, that are about real estate. And I think that from these ads, you really get a sense of what was driving the city. That there was, of course, investments that were sure to return 50% before the close of the present season. That the prospectus really set out the hope that we had for the city. That having 10 years, that this real estate agent had 10 years of experience in the western towns of the United States, and it was able and willing to offer investors valuable suggestions. Business for non-residents, carefully and accurately transacted, visitors and strangers cordially welcomed. And so it's in that theme that you see that this is the power of real estate, that you sold out of trees. You had the tree office, sustainable architecture back in the day, right? And the understanding that, I guess that would be what, lead tree? Lead green. But then really it's talking about how the boom was coming. And it's also within this boom how it was going to be fueled. And very much the image back then was about Vancouver, London of the Pacific. And it's in this directory you see these discussions of how Vancouver was a much shorter route to major Pacific cities, British Pacific cities, I should add, maybe with the exception of Japan, but from Melbourne to Hong Kong and the Yokohama, and how they were shortcuts. It was an amazing shortcut going through Halifax, Vancouver, via the railway to those cities as compared to the Suez Canal. And it's interesting to see that a lot of this was this measured by people? Was it measured by materials? Well, as much as there was an aspiration for Vancouver to be London of the Pacific, and that these dates chart the amount of time it got sent materials from Liverpool to these various cities in Asia and Australia, it's also the realization that Vancouver was also mail depot to the empire. That what was being used to measure these dates was actually the time it took registered mail to be sent from Liverpool to these areas. So the idea of Vancouver as the crossroads to the world, to where Asia and the Atlantic met, was set back in 1887. And it's from this perspective we see a continuity of this from 2011. That this is a map coming from the Vancouver Economic Commission, which I think really illustrates the ongoing relationship and perspective of Vancouver as a crossroads of the world. But I think as much as we think of the world coming in, I think that there is also an emerging and important realization of how Canadians are moving out. And that this is a perspective of Canadians abroad, that very much other than the United States, Hong Kong has the second largest population of Canadians, and that at 300,000 people, one can actually perhaps think of Hong Kong as the third largest municipality in Metro Vancouver. So very much this, I think, is an idea that there's a back and forth, that what used to be just an idea of coming in and landing in Vancouver, it is now a story of back and forth. And it's from that back and forth, not only from the world, but then also within Canada, we discover that Vancouver is a city from everywhere, that only 35% of the population in the city of Vancouver was actually born in the province of British Columbia. All those who were born in the province of British Columbia, raise your hand. Oh, wow. It's more than you than I thought. I had the same exercise over at the offices of Bing Thom Architects, and I was like, okay, let's see how many immigrants are here, and versus locals. Out of, I believe it was 45 people, I was the only one. So any attitudes of immigrants out would be problematic at Bing Thom Architects. Me too. So given that, what you want to do is actually understand how Vancouver is actually very different from the rest of Canada. That the rest of the country actually has a level of people who were born in each respective province, and that Vancouver is driven both by international migration, but then also internal migration from the rest of Canada. That very much the peoples who come to Vancouver are as much from Shanghai as they are from Saskatoon. And that this is a much different trend than what you see in other Canadian cities. And I think actually this was actually a bit surprising, very different from what you see from those immigrant cities in the United States. That in New York City, Los Angeles, cities that are often celebrated for being immigrant gateways, large immigrant cities, that their percentages are actually a lot higher for those born in each state than they are for Vancouver. And it's kind of in this theme there is, I think, a question, and it's a question that that happens a lot in my research, and is one of my research topics. It's foreign ownership. And I think that in this image, it's trying to engage the question of what is foreign. Who is foreign? And that if you look at this picture, who is foreign in this picture? How can you tell? And I think that this is part of the challenge as we move forward, as we think about really what is the impact of foreign ownership in Vancouver. But then there is this reality about foreign ownership in real estate. And I had to do this because it just, the media, obviously it's easy to blame the media, so I will. Perhaps needs to, and as well as the general public, needs to understand that, well, and I had to do this in like as big a font as I can, that there is no direct measurement of citizenship and property management in the province of British Columbia, period. And that this is part of the challenge in the work that I do in looking at looking at ownership and occupancy in Vancouver real estate, but yet one that really we're pursuing and trying to figure out what are at least the best measures we can use towards ownership patterns and occupancy. And this presentation won't focus on that. Where I have a paper that's in the works, and perhaps if there's interest, we'll have another session and talking about this, because it's a much larger and longer topic to think about the patterns of ownership and occupancy. But here's some of the ongoing patterns, in case you missed the talk last year, that very much when we look at ownership and non-ownership occupied, non-owner occupied, investor-owned, if you will, it's about 50 to 60% of condos in our study of downtown condominiums in Vancouver were investor-owned or non-owner occupied, and that was the pattern we found within downtown condominiums. More recently, we've begun examining single-family homes in the city of Vancouver, and this is a brand new slide that's making its premiere today, and really it's only about 15%. That's when we're talking about single-family homes, which kind of makes sense, because you imagine the kind of cost of single-family homes in Vancouver. It's a much more expensive endeavor to maintain a house than it is to engage a condominium. So from this perspective, I think you want to not drill in. I guess for me, a lot of this isn't just finding the patterns, but then trying to figure out what the problem is. And I think part of this is really trying to understand, why are real estate prices escalating the way they are? That this is a map of real estate prices, basically charting by about, I guess that'd be about almost 35 years of real estate prices in Metro Vancouver, and how very much single-family homes have escalated versus as well as other types of housing. And really, I think the question is why. And I think this is part of the exploration of foreign ownership in Vancouver real estate. And the pricing escalation is not geographically even. That very much when we look at residential real estate prices in Vancouver, particularly for single-family homes in 2009, this is a map of single-family home prices from 2009. And really what it shows is really where that $1 million line is, which effectively was Ontario, and really houses that were valued at less than $1 million are red. Everything else is over $1 million. And so in the span of just 5 years, and one thing to watch is actually the color change. That in the span of just 5 years, this is the pattern that occurs. That the growth of multi-million-dollar homes is one that really occurs in incredibly fast motions compared to other elements of the economy. And I think that this is actually remarkable for a city like Vancouver, I think for many reasons I'll talk about later on. But then it's from this perspective that one finds that single-family home prices actually values in the city of Vancouver were actually led from the top. That very much, if you look at homes worth under $1 million in that 5 years, they grew at a fairly nice 35% rate. The Yan inheritance estates, if you will, were part of that 30% increase, but that the increases in housing prices really were led from the top. That really your money wasn't well fed in. Well, it was okay on the east side, but also on actually not only the east side, but on the value of the house. But it was also in the multi-million-dollar homes, in homes over $1 million. It's actually in homes worth over $1 million that you see escalations of 40% and above. And to kind of put this in perspective, the overall percentages were City of Vancouver was 35%. If you put your money in the American Stock Exchange, it was 26%. Bad news on the Toronto Stock Exchange, it actually went down 18%. So it's in that context, the question is why? And I think it's in the question of why, there's also the question of what is the problem. But I think that this really, illustrates an aspect of Vancouver in the 21st century that is housing led from the very top, escalation led from the very top. But then why is also, I think, a consideration of these instruments of mass construction that have occurred from 1951 to 2013, that perhaps it's driven in part by population increase in the city of Vancouver. Certainly the population has increased since 1991, and as Francis identified, that there was a flat, if not decreasing motion in the 80s and late 70s in population, that very much it is driven by people moving in, and I think that's an important element to examine. But then coupled with that, and I think as important a topic for exploration is actually interest rates. That this actually reflects the interest rates that occurred between 1951 and 2013 and the rise of cheap and easy money to be borrowed. And I think it's the interplay between population growth and cheap and easy money that have come into the type of real estate market that we have today. And I think it's from that real estate market one also realizes that Vancouver in the 21st century and throughout the 20th century, actually the latter half of the 20th century, is actually a city of renters. That very much, that very much Vancouver remains a majority renter city at 51% today. But one actually sees that being a renter was actually much more prevalent actually in the earlier decades of the third of the century. And And the last time Vancouver was a majority homeowner city, it was actually in 1961. And it's from that perspective that actually I think I like to challenge the issue of home ownership, because home ownership is often seen as a means, an avenue towards security of tenure, that is having a place you can count on to be available for the decades of your life cycle in a city. And yet I think it's a city that's increasingly challenged. We find that in the 2001 census that about 46% of renters in the city of Vancouver are paying more than 30% of their income to rent, and that I think that is very different from what the rest of the nation faces in major cities, and that this is, I think, an element of the increasing lack of security of tenure in terms of affordability for Vancouverites. And I think that at the same time, ownership is not necessarily, again, a guarantee of security of tenure. We find that about 30% of homeowners actually pay more than 30% of their income into mortgages. And I think these are important numbers because it asks, well, what happens when there are changes in the financing system, but then also in one's job opportunities. And that's very different from the rest of the country. That when we look at, perhaps Toronto's a little closer, but really in terms of Edmonton, Montreal, and Calgary, and Winnipeg, and the national average, we really see how different Vancouver is from the rest of the country in terms of home ownership as a means of security and tenure. But it's from here I actually am interested in seeing various aspects of security and tenure, and part of this is income. That really, when we look at median household income in Vancouver, if we're Metro Vancouver, we're actually kind of back of the pack. That we're actually more around a Halifax when it comes to median household income than a Calgary. That very much, I guess, this is the benefit of exporting cheap hydrocarbons, that you get to be top of the heap along with Washington, D.C. So I guess they both specialize in exporting gas. So that very much this is, and that really, sorry, but that really this is a conversation of incomes. And I think incomes, I'll spend a little bit to talk about incomes, because one aspect of incomes is that they've been flat. They've been very, very flat, and in the city of Vancouver, and from that flat household income, one also finds education levels. That this occurs at the same time that when we talk about Metro Vancouver, we're a pretty smart region. That we're to the degree we have less folks who don't have degrees compared to others. We see sorry, I just want to quickly go through this. We actually have a surplus nationally when it comes to people with bachelor degrees and with master's degrees. And you'll see that we're actually about a third of us have our at least a bachelor's degree and more of a master's. But while we may be smart, we're not necessarily good at making money. And this is a chart of median household incomes, total incomes for people over the age of 25 to 55-year-olds, and bachelor degrees for the top 10 Canadian metropolitan areas. And anybody want to guess the number for Canada, for Vancouver? Kind of on the bottom. But one hopes that from a bachelor's degree that one gets a graduate school degree. And one hopes that one has that great master's or PhD, one's income's fate in the region is changed. And when we look at people with degrees above a bachelor's for their total incomes, and for the median total incomes, we find that, Toronto's top of the heap. I guess it's all those finance folks. And that really, Canada is about, the average in Canada for a master's degree for median total income is about $56,000. Vancouver, any bets? It's about $40,000, $48,000. So the good news is that you do see an increase in total income for a master's degree by about $8,000. but you may be for better off in other metropolitan areas. I think that this is, but I think, again, this is an interesting paradox where people come to Metro Vancouver with fairly large amounts of human capital, and yet I think the challenge for Vancouver in the 21st century is having them fulfill the potential of that human capital. The good news is that if you have an apprentice or trades degree, you're middle of the pack. You're earning a little less, but at least in the metropolitan areas, you're middle of the pack compared to being someone in the trades in Toronto or Montreal. And I think when we talk about incomes, we have to talk about industries. And we talk about industries, really the top 5 industries in Vancouver isn't real estate. It actually is a chimera of entities and the largest being professional, scientific, and technical services, to healthcare, to accommodations and hospitality, to retail, to education. And that the rest of the economy is a mixed bag, but a minority compared to these top 5 employers. And I think it's talking about the employers that one finds out that on a metropolitan level and very much on a city level, that the mass majority of our employers are small, that one finds that about 80% of our employers are smaller than 10 people, and certainly very small if you look at the majority at 60% from one to four employees. So it's from there, I think it sets out a discussion of its relationship to housing. That when we talk about incomes, this is a chart I'll spend a little time on, that when we begin charting this chart begins to look at the topic of median income. The higher up you go, the more money you're making as a median household, and the farther you go down this way, the more expensive your house is. And it's from this perspective one finds this is for a select group of metropolitan areas in Canada and the United States, the cool cities I like to hang out with and kind of fly through, and that very much this is, again, to a certain degree, expected, that one finds that in San Francisco there are very high incomes, but then at the same time fairly expensive pieces of real estate, compared to Detroit and New Orleans, where there are low incomes and very low, very high, but yet at the same time low median housing costs. Anybody care to wager where Vancouver sits? That this is Vancouver in 2011. It's here. So very much we're in between the housing values of Honolulu and San Francisco, but yet our incomes are about the same as Seattle and Halifax and New York City, but the New York City is a pretty big town to be distributing household income. So this is a shot of incomes to dwelling values in the 2011 census. And I think it's interesting to kind of see this in perspective. And again, the perspective of history, I think, begins to inform how the city is changing, how the region is changing. Because in 1990, that's the pattern for Vancouver. That we're very much in the middle of the pack, right next to Boston. And in that family, that very much the housing prices were Boston, but yet we had actually reasonably fair amounts, high amounts of income. Again, about Halifax. Apparently median household income for Vancouver is like our twin is Halifax. But yet when we talk about home ownership, we move into rents. And while Vancouver is by no imagination, median rents in Vancouver being cheap, that it's much more in line to incomes. That very much we see Halifax, and I like to think it's more the West Coast premium of being in between Halifax and Vancouver, that people do want to pay on the median about $200, $300 more of being in Vancouver than in Halifax. Any Haligonians who would disagree in the audience? Chances are you're probably here too. But that's really, it's this relationship of real estate prices to median household incomes. I think that informs some of the challenges we face in making a livable and sustainable region. But it's from this extent, I think one begins to acknowledge the role of building from the grassroots. That this is actually, when one finds the incredible networks of communities in Vancouver and networks of community centers in Vancouver, one finds that they actually began from building on the grassroots. This is a protest to establish the first Sunset Community Center in southeast Vancouver. That very much this is a group of children saying that we want a place to go when their work is done. And that this little girl here is saying we are not delinquents yet. So that very much it's I'm always curious if we can trace whether she became a delinquent or not. So when one sees from her story, it's actually how that the kind of community efforts in creating the Sunset Community Center that one calls in Bing Crosby. And that Bing Crosby actually helped fund in a concert the first Sunset Community Center. For all those millennials who may not be familiar with Bing Crosby, he does a great duet Christmas song, Little Drummer Boy, with David Bowie. And for all those millennials who don't know who David Bowie is, you are a Philistine. So it's from this perspective of look it up on your smartphones, okay? David Bowie Wikipedia. So it's this from this one perspective that 50 years later, that from this kind of this, I think it was something like $50,000 raised by this fundraising concert by Bing Crosby. That 50 years later, when the community in the Sunset neighborhood of Vancouver decide to build another community center, that 50 years later they come in and call another Bing to help put up their community center. So it's in that element. It's in it that this is, of course, a new Sunset Community Center, a wonderful place, amazing architecture, just fantastic place to be. And one also finds community activism in the very formation of Vancouver. That Vancouver actually originally began as 3 separate town entities: the city of Vancouver in 1886, South Vancouver in 1890, beginning in 1891, and Point Grey. And it's actually a plebiscite, a plebiscite through which was using this informed citizenship, the Union plebiscite in 1928, that really formed contemporary Vancouver. I know that plebiscites have been kind of popular in this town, and separation ballots have been kind of internationally been around. But here's the question that set up the current city of Vancouver, and yet here's the notion that vote as you wish, but vote. But then within this plebiscite, which eventually set up the city of Vancouver, we find the creation of the movements towards the first master plan in the city of Vancouver, and this new amalgamated city of Vancouver by Harlan Bartholomew. And it's within Harlan Bartholomew we see the creation of Vancouver's extensive networks of playgrounds, green spaces, and schools. And that at the core of each neighborhood in Vancouver is a school. And it's a remarkable legacy of the Commons coming in from the 1920s that really has evolved to a $4.2 billion inheritance through which I think questions what are we going to do with it into the future, as certainly schools and in certain other parts of the city, schools have been the dots that are in blue, particularly darker blue, indicate schools that have lost 25% of their population. That really one sees the concentration of schools that have lost 25% of their population focused around this kind of southeast section. But then also, of course, one has to recognize there's the rest of the region which has seen some declines in their public elementary schools. But then what's kind of important to note is actually the lack of people leaving the system. That as a total, as a region, we actually lost only 294 students, which is a minuscule amount out of the system. So it's from that commons that was developed by the city of Vancouver and other school districts, that one finds this network of infrastructure, of social and cultural infrastructure, that this is a map of arts and cultural organizations in the city of Vancouver, that this is a part of an initiative that we're mapping all the cultural and arts organizations in the city, and one finds that they are clustered around the east side, around the east end, and not in the rest of the city out here. And I think it's from that perspective, it's from that social infrastructure that one begins to examine civic engagement, and that this is where we begin our examination of civic engagement. This is a very fun initiative that we do at BTAworks along with Chad Skeldon from the Vancouver Sun online. It's a mapping of all the trick-or-treating hotspots in the city of Vancouver. We like to call it trick or tweet. That very much through social media, we have a documentation of where the hot trick-or-treating areas are. And I think, as much as one kind of begins with you think about trick-or-treating, right? It's the middle of the night, it's dark, you're opening your door to masked strangers. Now, on any other night, that's a home invasion. But on that night, it's a moment for community. And I think one observes, and it's something to observe, this crescent, and I just want to point out, to keep on watching this crescent, because this crescent is also one that fills out their census forms. In red, it means that these folks fill out their national household survey as opposed to other parts of the city, and I think that this is a pretty fun part of viewing community engagement and citizen action. That one also looks at really, I think one of the elements of citizen engagement, civic participation, is Vancouver as an emerging democracy, as a changing democracy. That this is excerpts from the Incorporation Act of 1921, modified in 1937. This tells you who can be a voter or not, and this is actually an element where one finds that, you can be you could be every person, male or female, of full age of 21 could vote, but then corporations could vote. That corporations weren't only people, they were voters, and that this is an element of a changing and evolving democracy, because it's not only how corporations vote, but also who can't vote. In pretty much until 1950, that no Chinaman, Hindu, Japanese, or Indian shall be counted to vote in municipal elections. I think the good news is maybe the Sikhs could vote, right? They probably got an excerpt for the Sikhs because they weren't mentioned, obviously, in this list. But I think it's from actually this act of exclusion. One finds actually would contemporary Vancouver, if we were to ban certain groups from voting, would we even notice? Because we find out that only about 35% of the population really showed up to vote last time. And I think that really, I think, is a cause of concern. Why do people not vote in municipal elections at a level that is arguably the most exposed and most experienced? And obviously, these are people who are not readers of Francis Beulah's blog. The good news is that this is actually a little better than other municipalities. Because when one finds other municipalities, they don't vote either. The city of North Vancouver, Neil, only shows 21% shows up to vote. That's the city of North Van content for this presentation, which is a lot different from other cities in North America and in Canada, that when one finds that cities in Calgary and Toronto, that about 50% of the population votes. Now, one kind of reads a lot of things into this pattern, like the idea that you want an interesting mayor, that when you have participation rates over 50%, you actually have pretty interesting mayors kind of evolve, compared to Montreal. Hey, there's plenty of fodder to write in the news, right? So compared to Montreal, which perhaps has another different type of mayoral system, compared to frequent cyclical changes of order, and compared to Seattle. And it's this changing democracy that one kind of sees in Vancouver that is actually remarkable to kind of observe from the Vancouver of 2011 to even the Vancouver of 1999. And in 2011, this is the turnout rate for each poll in Vancouver for that election, that you very much see where the voters are turning out. And remember that crescent of super participants where there are great trick-or-treating opportunities? That one sees a parallel in voter turnout. That very much this is about voter turnout and where they are turning out and where they're not. And where they're not is actually in the southeast corner compared to really how much this has changed in 1999. Anybody want to make observations for what 1999 might look like? This map is about 15 years in the making because I had to wait that long until the technology caught up. But that this is, actually when I was kind of talking to Francis, this is when I first got the data, that this is the map from 1999. That turnout rates were very much higher in the southeast section of Vancouver the southwest section of Vancouver as opposed to other parts of the city of Vancouver. And this is, again, 2011 to 1999. And when we talk about turnout, that I think one of the unique aspects of Vancouver is that we have an at-large system, which is based upon volume of voters, and one begins to observe where are the volumes of voters coming from in the city of Vancouver. And that in 2011, and because it's not about ridings, it's not about little districts, about when you actually get, if you're top of the list in little districts, it's actually how much of the city you can bring together to get the vote for you. That this is observing really, the next slide is really talking about where those hot spots are for voter turnout, that at least for those who turned out to vote. That red here indicates those hot spots where they are above average in places that who show up to vote. Yellow is average, they show up some, and they are but average, and then blue is below average. That these are areas that have below average turnout when it comes to when it comes to people who show up to vote. And I think it's important to note the changes from 2011 to 1999. Again, this is a moment to kind of guess what the pattern is for 1999. This is the pattern of 1999. That in 1999, very much when you look at the patterns of people who turn out to vote, it's actually a much more distributed pattern than I thought would occur in the city of Vancouver. I actually thought that there'd be much more of that kind of east-west, the legendary east-west divide in the city of Vancouver. But then you actually find a fair amount of people who turn out to vote from this southeast, which is actually another point to explore, is really this corner, which often gets forgotten, I think, in Vancouver politics, of southeast Vancouver, compared to other parts of the city. And of course, I think the interesting question is what is happening in this southwest corner, and then this rise of this crescent, which again shows actually even back in 1999 there is this perspective of coming out to vote, and I think it's in this pattern of voting one sees changes, and it is about the changing political landscape of Vancouver, but then also the changing development patterns in the city of Vancouver. And I see Patrick Condon in the audience. Patrick, these slides are for you. That very much when you look at rezonings in the city of Vancouver, particularly for buildings over 5 stories, and the reason why you look at over 5 stories is that that's a high rise in Statistics Canada numbers, but that when you dig around in the development permits looking for rezonings, this is how things changed from 2000 to 2014 around the city of Vancouver. That this is a pattern of development in, that's odd. That this is actually, the patterns from 2000 to 2009, it was concentrated in the city of Vancouver, in the downtown core, and slight bits of downtown and other parts of that, larger downtown. But that beginning in 2010, it didn't show up. But in 2010, the map, I'll perhaps grab it from another map, that very much one sees the spreading of development and rezoning right throughout the rest of the city, and very much its development where there are neighbors as opposed to surplus amounts of industrial land. And we'll show that map in another, hopefully with the backup slideshow. But it's from there one finds really this type of pattern that really 42% of rezonings in the city of Vancouver actually occur between 2010 and 2014 compared to other years. That very much rezoning had occurred in the city, but that it was really within the last 4 years that one sees a fair amount of rezonings. And I think part of this, reflects actually the fact that when you look at outside the downtown core, it goes under a large zoning requirement that dates back from 1958, if John Atkins told me things correctly, that really part of this is actually what does a new zoning regime look like, that for a lot of cities around, actually up and down the West Coast, they are actually challenging the zoning. They're actually rewriting their zoning code. That in Los Angeles, there's Recode LA, which is really dealing with a zoning regime that is dating back from 1947 and an update of that zoning just simply on what the new demands are for development in the city of Los Angeles. So, almost done. That really part of this is understanding the physical city, but then also understanding the social elements of the city. That when we talk about who's moving into the city of Vancouver, one finds that there is fortunately a large amount of 25 to 29-year-olds moving into the city of Vancouver, but then very large amounts of folks over the age of 65 who are also coming into the city of Vancouver, who are both aging in the city of Vancouver, but then also moving in. So that the 5 fastest growing age cohorts in the city of Vancouver are actually, when we look at it, over the age of 60 as the top one. And I mean, the good news is that 25 to 29-year-olds are still coming, but that they're about mid-pack. But that 2/3 of the new population in the city of Vancouver is actually over the age of 55. And when we look at children, that there is a bit of decline when we look at children, particularly before the high school ages. And I think it's from that aging of the city that one, I think, needs to recognize that our population of 75-year-olds are increasing, that it's very much it's not going to decrease, and that the majority of these will still be women, that men are quickly getting to live longer, but that the majority of these seniors will be women from today and well into the 21st century. I raise this point because I think what happens when you age into the city, what happens when you're not necessarily those of the beautiful in the condo ads, that is there room in the city for you? And I think I put this in because this is an important conversation, is the question of poverty and equality in the city, that when we look at really the poorest postal codes in Canada, that yes, Vancouver is represented, it is in the downtown east side, but that it's not the top most porous postal code in Canada. That's in Winnipeg, and shared between Winnipeg and Montreal, compared to really Vancouver and the downtown east side. For some strange reason, V6T is the university district. It's UBC, so I guess it's all those low-income students. But I think out of this seriousness is when you break down that poverty, that where Vancouver is actually housing the poorest postal code, it actually occurs when you talk about seniors, that when it comes to seniors, the poorest postal code in Canada, number 2, is the downtown east side, where 58% of seniors live in poverty. And this is a part of a much longer conversation. I won't engage in this talk. But that very much the question is, what happens when you are in an increasing bipolar city? That for every household earning over $100,000 a year, there's a household earning less than $20,000. And what happens when you deal with that population? And so we're looking at really, I think, from that changing economic base and that changing social base, one talks about, and we're getting close to the end here, that we're looking at about the changing climates, that about the changing coastline of Vancouver, that very much in the history of Vancouver, changing coastlines are a reality in the past, but then also a reality in the future, that very much this bridge is actually Main Street, that this reflects that coastlines do change in this region. This is a photograph of that False Creek back in the 1880s to present day Vancouver, and that really the changing coastlines are a reality for Vancouver, as every other coastal city is going to face into the 21st century. That this is Vancouver today at high tide, but that moving forward, we're going to see an increasing influence of climate change. And it's really at the 3-meter level. This represents what happens when the sea level rise increase by a meter. That it's not only just that meter, but then 2 meters above that, that is going to be an affected area. And of course, that's about 8% of the city that will see this type of affected area due to climate change and sea level rise. But then not all land is created equal. And I think this emphasizes the importance of land use and decisions on where and what to develop. That very much we look at, well, the really high area here is, there we go. The really high area is actually agricultural land, which there isn't too much, but I think the point of conversation and importance into the 21st century is industrial land, that we find out that 30% of our industrial land, and it's not surprising because Vancouver is a coastal industrial town, that one finds that will be land, that land type that will be heavily affected. So, I think I'd like to introduce you to the 4th generation of Yans. Not mine, but this is the 4th generation, somebody who will likely bear witness to this climate change. My guess is most of us in this room will not make it out of the mid-2050s, maybe. But that Natalie, sorry guys, but that Natalie Ella Yan will likely see what's going to happen. And there's a great line from Stuart Brand about the importance of being a good ancestor. I'm desperately trying to be avoided the label of idiot planner uncle. So that it's in that aspirations that motivates some of my work. But that I think this begins talking about painting urban futures and visions of of Vancouver, of what kind of city are we creating, what kind of region are we becoming in the 21st century. That are we one of a city that eats its young? That this is a painting by Goya about how Saturn devouring his son. The legend is, of course, how Saturn hears that his children will someday succeed him, and he begins to eat every one of them until one son by the name of Zeus beats out the system. Is it going to be this? Is it Narcissus? This is a painting of Narcissus by Caravaggio. The legend of Narcissus is a person who falls in love with their image, but that ultimate story ends because he starves to death by just total infatuation with their image. But I think we can be something more, that we have to be something more. And I end with perhaps this vision of Vancouver, not only Vancouver, but Metro Vancouver in the 21st century. That nurse logs, that the idea that cities grow from generation to generation, and that very much the experiment is not over, and that only the work begins now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I'll invite our responders up here who are going to have 5 minutes apiece to reflect on that. And I think all of us are probably going through the same experience right now. I know I always go through this every time I talk to Andy, as I can feel all these gears whirring in my brain because the one slide alone prompts 10 questions. There's so many things that it makes me think about. And one of the great experiences with Andy is going back and forth with him about, well, what does this really mean? You know, if the incomes are this level or if there's these many young people. So I'm looking forward to what struck the responders in this. And I'm going to introduce them just before they speak. I won't introduce everybody all at once, just before they speak. So our first responder is Peter Ladner, who some of you may know, just possibly, former councillor, city councillor at the City of Vancouver, Metro Vancouver vice chair, right? The author of a really interesting book on urban agriculture since he stopped being a councillor, the founder of Business in Vancouver, and an ongoing columnist there, where he frequently writes about urban issues. So I'll let Peter speak first.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. Wow, what an honor to be in a room with all these people who love their city, and I can see so many people who have contributed so much to the city, and I feel very sort of, why me at the front here. I'll do my best to live up to the billing. I want to start by asking anybody who's an elected official here to stand up. Are there any elected officials? Oh my goodness, it's election season and none? Are there any people here running for elected office?
Pete Fry is here. I saw him.
Do you want to just stand up?
We can't quite see you because they have the Klieg lights shining.
And just call out your names really briefly and what you're running for.
Pete Fry, City Council, Green Party. Bob Casting and running for mayor.
Nicholas Turner running for council.
Charlene Dan running for council.
Mike Wheaton, Park Board, Green Party.
So I just want to recognize these people because, thank you. Because the next phase of the future of Vancouver is in their hands, and it's in your hands to pick them too. So I want to talk about, I want to tell, 5 minutes, my gosh.
But you'll get to say more things after.
Okay, thank you.
This is just the beginning.
So I'll do a little personal story to start with. My great-grandfather and his brother came out here in the 1850s and founded the town of Ladner. My great-grandfather started the first fish cannery. And just as a way of sort of illustrating how things have changed and the evolution, they came from England, from a mining background there, and they were natural resource people. They came out here looking for natural resources, the gold rush, and they ended up settling in, and my great-grandfather became the first president of the Delta Farmers Institute and had a fish cannery, as I mentioned. And that's the world that is going away. There are no more fish canneries anywhere around here. There used to be 12. And I have a son and a daughter-in-law working at a restaurant that serves healthy fast food, and they're trying to get back to finding fresh local food to serve to people. It's called Smack. And interestingly, here we are in an era of I want to just say that the nature of work is changing so much, and it's such a reflection on the future of our city. And we're now in an era where, as Andy showed, I don't know if you were deliberately showing the low income levels in the green bar. Is this your way of describing the greenest city? We have the lowest incomes?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay. But we're facing a world where technology and automation are taking away a whole bunch of jobs. Global trade is taking away a whole bunch of jobs. We're competing with people around the world. And in my generation, my second son has married a woman from China. In 3 weeks, we're going to China to meet the rest of my family in Wuhan, China. And we're going to parade my first grandson around to meet the relatives. And I'm going to meet the relatives. So that's an interesting kind of personal illustration of just what Andy was talking about. I couldn't resist that. I also wanted to note that I love that slide about the little piece of Vancouver that's downtown and then the slightly bigger piece that's Vancouver and then, oh yeah, all the rest of the region. And I think we live very much, I'm kind of in the Narcissus camp. I think we live in the conceit of this greenest city. You can go sailing in the morning and skiing in the afternoon. Has anyone ever done that? And play golf in between. And run around the seawall while you're getting from one place to the other. But really, it's not about that. And if you look, I credit Gordon Price with so many insights that I echo around about the city. But we, in the rest of the region where the real nuts and bolts and dollars are all happening, we're going backwards. We're going back to the 20th century with bigger roads, bigger bridges, bigger tunnels, more cars, more spread out, and we are completely not doing what we fancy ourselves to be doing. And I think we need to puncture that bubble and deal with the reality of what's going on and try to turn that one into the needs for the 20th century, which are a green retrofitted infrastructure with things, the Internet of Things, and everybody generating micropower and all that kind of stuff, and not pipelines and big dams. Finally, because time is just about up, I wanted to just reference this issue of the unaffordable housing and say that as this election approaches, one of the big problems of dealing with this issue is the people who come out to vote and the people who finance the voting system and the electoral system in the cities of Vancouver, all the municipalities, are disproportionately weighted on the side of people who want housing prices to keep going up. And I own a house, my house price is going up, lucky me. But the people who are disenfranchised, and I hope some of them are in here, and I hope they're going to get active, are typically younger people too busy distracted or watching too much Facebook to vote. And they may not even live here because they're people who would like to come in here and work, or they're younger people who've been driven away. Yes, I think people are leaving the city to go find work and opportunity in other places. And we have to decide who the city is for. Is it for these aging seniors who want to come in and put their feet up by the coffee shop on the seaside and walk their dogs with boots on? Or is it people who want to actually do some work in the city and make it vibrant and lively and fill those arts organizations with really creative people? And so I think that's one of the big challenges that faces us. How do we create the city that we want when the people who really have to make it go aren't really adequately represented in both the money side and the voting side of politics? I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Next up for her 5 minutes, exactly, is Vanessa Timmer, and I'll just read this out so that you can feel as tired as I did when I read this. Co-founder and executive director of One Earth, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to transform production and consumption patterns locally. So, good luck with that. And let us know in 2 years if you've done it. No, very ambitious, and Vanessa, for those of you who don't know her, and I'm not familiar with her work myself, is an associate with the Sustainability Science Program at Harvard and was a Fulbright research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So, your thoughts on Andy's talk?
Great. Thanks so much, Francis. Thanks so much for your talk, Andy. And at the beginning, Francis said, you're wanting to make the world a better place. And just by bringing these stories to light, I think you're really doing it. So thank you so much for that. I was born here in Vancouver, and in fact, to a Dutch-Canadian immigrant. My dad, who's sitting over here, is also an architect who's helped me see the world through the lens of how this place has evolved over time. And just last Sunday, we were at the People's Climate March, looking at what this means, what Andy was referring to. What does this mean in terms of these larger global trends and how they impact Vancouver? And so, I think both about the kind of DNA and the things that have been shifting in the city, but also some of these larger global trends. And I just want to pick up on what Andy was suggesting at the end, which is, what are we actually wanting Vancouver to be like? And what, in a way, are those nurse logs, like those kind of things that are feeding the way that this city might emerge? So in the next few minutes, I just wanted to put forward 3 things that I think might be some of those nurse logs. So some of you might know that today is actually National Tree Day, and TD just came out with a report that says that the trees in the city of Vancouver actually contribute millions of dollars per year in assets or benefits to the city, and particularly around air quality. And I would say that's one way of looking at nature, but there's another part of it, which is that we can really see nature as design. So one thing that Francis was informing me about is that I have a nonprofit called One Earth, and One Earth is collaborating with groups across Canada in an initiative called Cities for People. And we're actually looking at how new economies are emerging, how urban resilience and livability is shifting. And one of the projects that the Cities for People project is really supporting is something which has a very strange name. It's called industrial symbiosis. And what that means is that industries in the same area start thinking of themselves as an ecosystem. Just a little ways away from here is Strathcona, one of the oldest industrial areas. And a tofu place that was putting tofu into tofu containers was taking the tofu edges, and they were being sent to landfill. But right next door was the food bank. And the connections were not being made. So the Strathcona Business Improvement Association started a resource exchange where waste products, paper, old carpet cuttings, whatever, from one place could become the resources for the next one. So I think that's one thing. This in design inspired by nature might be a nurse log for us for the future. The second one I think is around ownership. And I think a lot of, Andy, what you were saying was kind of referring to different ownership models in the city. And we're seeing this with the millennial generation, which doesn't own cars, which isn't looking at owning houses. But it's much more than that. Let's look at what Andy was referring to in terms of the public commons, the civic commons. So I would put forward that maybe ownership is another piece that we should really bring up to the surface to see how we might shift in the 21st century in rethinking ownership. What about cooperatives? What about civic assets like our parks, our post offices? How are they going to be feeding this civic engagement that Andy was mentioning? And the third thing I just want to offer forward to you is around the last few slides that Andy was presenting about the future. One of the things, I've been involved in the environmental movement, and of course, being a Vancouverite, this is kind of part of who I am. Greenpeace started here. You know, environmentalism is in my blood. But I had to say that my mentors in the environmental movement have depressed me so much over the years. And I always wondered, can we only get to solutions through telling the negative stories? Or is part of our parcel really about pulling from the kind of compelling futures? So Joe Hall and myself and others are working on a project where we're working with the arts to create lived, embodied experiences of what life and sustainable futures might feel like, working with designers, animators, filmmakers, storytellers. It's called Disruptive Imaginings, and it's really about let's have an explosion of imagination of what the future might look like. So that last bit about the arts engagement, I think, is a crucial nurse log. And we can see it in the reconciliation in terms of First Nations culture. We can see it in terms of how we're redefining the city, in terms of all of these multiple perspectives. So I would say that is such a potent place for us to start. So nature, ownership, culture, and the arts, these, I think, are the nurse logs for the future. And I look forward to continuing to evolve Vancouver together. Thank you.
And last is Matt Hearn, who I know will come in with something that will pop your head off in his inimitable way. Matt lives on the east side, is an activist there. Some people may remember he was the person who started the concept of car-free days when he was just trying to get a community event going to express concern in a way about the twinning of the Port Mann Bridge. He's written a couple of books. One is Common Ground in Liquid City, Essays in Defense of an Urban Future. He's taught in many universities and lectures globally, and lives with cats and chickens on the east side. Okay, so take it away.
Well, thanks for that, you guys. So I was furiously scribbling notes down here, so I got a couple of ideas that I'd like to just to share with you guys. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this event on Coast Salish territory, on the traditional, the occupied, and the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. So I'd like to say thanks kindly to their generosity and hospitality in having us here. As well, I'd like to thank Am and Andrea and Fiorella for hosting this. Nicely done. And to the panelists today for I'm going to echo much of what you had to say. And particularly, I'd say thanks, Andy. Thanks, bud, for doing great. Because for so long, in my experience here, in a professional way, but also in a friendship way, and I think for so many of us in this room, Andy has taken the time and done all the hard work to put meet on a lot of fairly fuzzy ideas that I have had, and a lot of ideas that I've been kind of yapping off about over the years, but without a whole lot of basis. Andy provides that kind of basis for many of us, a lot of the actual raw material and the data that many of us are really thankful for. And so for that, thanks again, man. There was tons more to think about, and I really appreciate that. And a lot of what I pulled out of tonight, and much of the stuff, and much of the conversations Andy and I have had over the years, is that in a lot of ways we are talking about a city of inequity. I think Andy spent a lot of time, not just in the cute title, Vancouver, the 21st Century, which echoes Thomas Piketty, but also to understand that we are living in a lot of ways in a dual city. A city of bifurcation, a city that is very separated in lots of ways. And so in many ways, that's why I find it particularly problematic to talk or to use language around our city or how we think or what the city of Vancouver believes, because my first question is, who are you talking about exactly when you talk about us? And primarily when we talk about inequity, in lots of ways, I think we are fundamentally talking about land. And in part, one of the tropes that has emerged often and frequently, and I think is really problematic in all kinds of ways, is conversations about foreign ownership. And Andy and I have spoken about this as well. I think it's a red herring, and I think it's BS for the most part, that conversation. I think what we're really talking about is we're talking about speculation. I think that is the issue. I don't think it matters where people come from. I think the issue that we're really talking about here is the notion that much of this city's presumed prosperity is built around the notion of turning land into profit. And it is a notion that we would blanch at if we were talking about profiteering off of air or talking about profiteering off of water. But somehow we've normalized the idea of profiteering off of land. And to my mind, that first question, if we're going to talk about inequity, if we're going to talk about this bifurcated city that Andy demonstrates in so many ways, what we really need to talk about is different ways to think about ownership, as Vanessa's talked about here. Is we need to think about ownership, we need to think about equity, we need to think about land. And I think primarily, we need to talk about sovereignty. I think we need to talk about different kinds of sovereignty and what we mean by sovereignty, what we mean by exclusion, and what we mean by access. And I'll give you a little story that might echo some of your own experiences. Is that a buddy of mine, a good friend of mine, who I arrived in the city in 1991 to have kids, and a buddy of mine scraped together a little bit of money from his family, and they bought a house just off Hastings Street for about $200,000. That house has been assessed recently at around $940,000, which mirrors the rise of property values in the city in general. And he's a good guy, and he's taking care of the house well, but he hasn't taken care of he hasn't added $740,000 of value to that house. He's fixed the roof and painted a little bit, but he hasn't done a whole lot. That value, that $740,000 approximately of increased value, that is socially created value. That value is created by all of us, by everybody in the city, and by primarily people that work towards the commonality of the city. The city, to use a phrase that my friend Elvin Wiley uses well, is the city is a social achievement. But somehow we have normalized the idea of differential access to the benefits and primarily to the profits of that social achievement. So I'd be really careful talking about using ideas like we're a rich city. I think that's true in some ways, but again, I would ask, who's that we we're talking about? And I would say again that in that globalized pursuit of profit, primarily in this city through land, is a presumption, a normalized idea that chasing global investment is what a city should do. That the presumed aspiration, the yearning for global cityness, is become so normalized in our minds as to prefigure the notion of city itself. And that assigns a particular set of values to what the city is and what the city is capable of and what the city should be. And primary among those is the idea of scarcity, that there's not enough here, that we do not have enough, that we have to be constantly making ourselves available for investment. From overseas, for sure, from anybody, from people in other parts of Canada, from places, other parts of British Columbia, anyone really who has capital is invited here to invest. And those terms are usually dictated by those with capital. And I think that is a particular kind of lie of capitalism. It is a lie of scarcity. And I would suggest to you that if we are going to think new ways in new ways about the city. If we are going to think about a city that is not defined by a particular bifurcation, that is not designed as particularly as a city of inequities, as a city with the second highest property values in the world in lots of ways compared to incomes. We look at a city with skyrocketing property values, and a city with an income, like Andy has demonstrated well, with income somewhere between Nashville, Tennessee, and Reno, Nevada. That doesn't sound like a rich city to me. But if we're going to talk about a different kind of city, if we're going to talk about an equitable city, if we're going to talk about an ecological city, we have to be talking about capital. And if we're going to talk about capital, I think we have to be talking about land. And if we're going to talk about land, I think we need to think about exclusion, we need to think about access, and more than anything, and I think it's our primary task in many ways in an era of ecological crisis, is to talk about sharing, is to talk about how that we can allocate access to what is in fact not scarce here, but is abundant. That we live in a city of abundance, we live in a region that is defined by abundance, that there is enough here. And that what we need to do is to talk about access to that, about who's getting excluded from that abundance and why. And to my mind, what that involves is a conversation about reasserting the value of the commons and about commonality.
So,
Done.
That's very provocative. I told you he would do that. So you have 10 minutes to talk among yourselves, and then we'll go to the audience. Andy, do you want to respond to some of what you heard? And especially the idea that there is no commonality at the moment, the way the city is structured.
Hello?
Yeah.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Well, I think it's interesting to kind of see that commonality and what happens when I think Vancouver is at its best when we do things together. That when we talk about some of the institutions that we celebrate the most, it actually is the story of grassroots action. One thinks about Vancity. How did Vancity start? Well, it actually began as a reaction of the exclusion of those living on the east side by the East Coast banks. And a group of citizens, I think it was like 15 founding citizens, who created Vancity. And what is Vancity today? It's one of the most important social investment institutions in the region. It is a model for the world. And I think that that's an example of when we find that commonality, that in this challenge, in this struggle, I think in the type of forces that we face today, that very much we are at our best when we can come together, when we can build across those differences. That one of the aspects of what we face into the future is we're becoming a city of coalitions, that I don't think you can do things and affect change without coalitions. And I think that very much one thing that really blew my mind away when I was mapping voting patterns is that this whole idea of an east-west breakdown is, I think, a welcome change. That the standard narrative that has occurred throughout the 20th century does not in any way define what we are in the 21st. And that in the 21st century, Vancouver, I think, in its social movements have to approach the concept of coalitions and bridge building. That the era of clubhouses are over, and that I think the greatest success is when you become a lighthouse and can shine a light on an issue and bring people together as a beacon of action.
You can all just jump in, the three of you, anytime. It's a free-for-all.
Sorry, I'm done. Thank you. I really want to hear from the audience. I really want to hear from you folks.
If you want to move straight to questions, we can do that. Okay, because I think we've got people lined up already. So I understand there are people with microphones, one on each side. So if you can go to the people with the microphone, and I'll alternate sides of the room. So you can try and game that system if you like. Decide which side you're going to go to. So I can't tell if that's someone I know way up there, but go ahead.
Hi, Francis. Jason Gordon. I'm just wondering how, Andy, your last comments about being a lighthouse, a beacon for inclusiveness, fit with the gentleman before that about really exclusion of arguably a successful demographic. And that, to me, doesn't fit. Vancouver's an open city that brings one and all. And if we're going to exclude, we've had for forever, really, people that have struggled come to Vancouver. Oftentimes it's simply for weather. Are we going to exclude there too? Andy, question to you. How does what you said about being a lighthouse jive with the gentleman before you? Thanks.
Well, I think the lighthouse is actually how do we engage that exclusion. Do not think that exclusion is exclusively the property of those who live in the city of Vancouver. It is a global phenomenon that requires a local response. And that is amidst the challenge, many challenges that we move into the 21st century. How do we deal with the issues of exclusion within the history that we have come from and within the people that make this city?
I think you might have misunderstood what Matt was saying. I think you think he was saying we should exclude people because they're wealthy. And he wasn't. He was talking about how this is a city that excludes people because of the way capital works in it, and so a lot of people end up getting excluded. Maybe I've misunderstood, but it seemed to me you were thinking he was calling for exclusion, and that wasn't what Matt was saying.
Are you sure?
I'm pretty sure, but I'll let Matt talk.
That's all good. I accept that. It's fine. I go, Brett.
So who's next? Oh, Randy,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Randy Chatterjee. I loved your last slide, Andrew, about the nurse log, the manifestation of something which I think Matt might have described as the social value of all our real estate. Perhaps Vanessa as the art that really supports amazing accomplishments, and maybe Peter and jobs. I'm curious what you think more about what a nurse log, which we don't have in Vancouver anymore, not physically, except for maybe Pacific Bear Park. What else it really requires? What is the manifestation of this nurse log for us, and what do we need to see there?
So did everyone hear that? Because I'm not sure his microphone was working very well. He was asking Andy's idea of what could be a nurse log in Vancouver for the future. Go ahead.
Well, I like some of the stuff that's happened in Vancouver that we've seemed to rally around, the memes, tropes that have come out of Vancouver, Greenpeace, the 100-mile diet, the cyberspace, and these things. And I think that one of the ones that's taking shape now is the sharing city, which is exploding all over the place. But to me, that's a really wonderful, uplifting, economically viable alternative to the way things are going, where we're all spreading out and becoming more unequal. And this is the notion. Vancouver is a leader in car sharing, for example. We have the 3 car share companies, organizations, co-ops, whatever, and high participation rates. I think we get it. We get the sharing thing. Again, I'll go back to my point that it's mostly in the denser parts of the city, that the inner city, that these things are happening, and not so much in Coquitlam and Langley, but it's coming there. And I think that the collaborative economy, collaborative consumption, the sharing economy is, for me, the beacon for the future. And it's a way that we can escape our natural resource heritage and start to do way more with way less, but get a way better quality of life that's more affordable, so that people who don't own a bunch of stuff can still get access to it and have a very rich and great life. And I just got to throw one out there. Also, we share information, of course, through all the social media. And I just love, there's got to be something that can be built out of the rave rides that people, the one that happened in June. Was anybody here on that ride? 5,000 people rode their bikes around the seawall. No permits, no permission, all fun, lighted up bikes, booming sound systems, doing little improv parties all along the way, not really disturbing that many people, and having a little bit of fun. And I think there's some of those kind of things that are happening in Vancouver, and with the sharing, that maybe the nurse logs for some kind of cultural integration or enlivenment or something.
It's interesting because I remember sitting in the Acme Oyster House in post-Katrina New Orleans. It was a year after year after hurricane, and I was sitting there. It's almost like a scene out of Graham Greene, that you're sitting there with a whole bunch of your fellow planning consultants on figuring out how the city of New Orleans could recover. And there was a local, and we asked, hey, what would be the 3 things that you need to repair the city of New Orleans, you know, as a kind of conversation? And he said 3 things. First, levees, because it's important not to flood again. Second, jobs. That very much the economic base, is really what you need to build on, and how that has changed in a place like New Orleans. And third, education. That the education system, the public education system in New Orleans, is an abysmal wreck. And I think that this is, I think in the coming out of the shadows of a very long teacher strike, is a commitment towards public education. You really do not want to be in any city with a terrible public education system. I think that, granted, public education, you know, ought to evolve and change. I mean, I remember being a alumnus of Vancouver Technical. I mean, I come from a high school, a graduate, where you had two professional careers, right? One was going to be someone who works in a factory, and the second was being cannon fodder somewhere on some fields in Flanders. And that was the series of public education growing up at Vancouver Technical. But that how that evolves and how we have those institutions of social mobility and education, I think will define really the key nurse log moving in, is that societies, great cities, don't develop without great public education.
That's interesting, because those were 2 really different responses. One was kind of how to have fun in the midst of scarcity and share scarce resources, and the other was more about some other social structures. So are there other people waiting to ask questions? Up there, halfway up.
Are you going over there?
I didn't see a hand over there,
Okay.
so it is that side's turn.
Right.
So, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Just following up on the person who had the question about what are the good nurse logs, I can't remember your name, the woman who's speaking. Vanessa. I thought Vanessa had some really good suggestions for nurse logs. But the other thing is, I would be really interested in hearing a little bit more. Somebody talked about new forms of ownership, and I know that this is a discussion that we're having in False Creek. And it's an exciting discussion and seems really relevant in the context of what we're talking about.
So, sorry, what do
New
you mean
forms
about
of what
what's
kind of
happening in
ownership?
False Creek?
Home ownership, are you talking about?
And only, and if you want somebody to speak more about it, it shouldn't be me. There are other people here who have given this more thought.
But I'm not sure what you mean. Home ownership in False Creek, like I feel familiar with the issues, but I'm not sure what you mean.
In Falls Creek, we have been looking at some possibilities around land trusts, that sort of thing.
Okay, great.
Is that the sort of vehicle?
Yeah, I just
that we're
wasn't
talking about?
sure what you meant. So you're a group that's looking at some alternative ideas for home ownership. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this is exactly what we need to be talking about. So one of the things that's happening is that there have been a number of cooperatives and rental shared kind of ownerships that have been supported by the federal government, some of which are actually coming to their end. Some of the tenures of those are coming to an end. And I think looking forward, when we're thinking about how do we actually start looking at the abundance mentality and this sharing mentality, it is going to be through thinking about things like land trust, like cooperatives. And what I'm seeing is that we're really needing to look at our regulatory and legal arrangements that we have right now in order to support those, because we don't have a lot of those in place. And in fact, it's really been predominantly towards private ownership. And this is happening both in home ownership, but also in collaborative housing of industry, for example. There's a lot of hurdles within that. So we're seeing this showing up in all sorts of places where things have been kind of geared towards private ownership, and we're wanting to shift this over. So the only thing I want to say about that as well is that we're just about to launch a project around rethinking ownership, my nonprofit One Earth. And so, I have smatterings of examples right now, but within the next year and a half, we'll be looking at this in a lot more detail. So I just would welcome you to come and talk with me afterwards, and then we can connect about how those ownership models are evolving. Yeah, and I would welcome anyone else from the room who's been through some of these kind of shifting ownership model evolutions to speak up as well.
Great, thank you. There was a question here.
Francis, I have the mic. Does that make a difference? Hi, Francis. It's
Who
Pete.
has the mic?
It's
oh,
Pete Fry.
way up
Hi.
there. Oh,
way up here. Hi. Look up.
Sorry.
Way up.
I was looking at this woman down here, so you'll go next, okay? Hi, Pete. Yes, it's very dark up there.
So hi. So, well, first off, everybody, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the panelists, and you didn't have enough time. Maybe, Am, you can look to a future series with some of our panelists. So, of course, the big issue now is affordable housing, and that's what's on everybody's lips. But I wanted to touch on something that Andy had mentioned. When you talked about 80% of the employment in this city being employers of 10 or less, so that's a lot of small business employment in this city. And in previous conversations, you'd mentioned that you saw some dark clouds on the horizon as far as the attendant land lift and how that's going to affect commercial space. And I wondered if you had any more research to share on the impacts of land and land cost and commercial space in the city and the future.
Well, actually, there's an interesting phenomenon that actually just happened within the most recent assessment year, from 2013 to 2014. So you take the various types of land in the city of Vancouver. By percentage, what land use type increased the highest, and what area of the city? What houses in Shaughnessy? Maybe it's a Point Grey mansion. Maybe it's a house on the east side.
Come on, you policy nerds. Some of you know the answer there.
It was actually industrial land within the inner core. That actually increased over in 1 year 25% and up. That your best investment was actually on light investment, on light industrial land in around the downtown core. And I think that, the question is that a reflection of demand for a new industrial dynamo that's coming out of the city of Vancouver? Or is it a play towards future and prospective land development for condominiums and residential housing? Because I think it's important to note that a lot of the businesses that have seen the greatest success in Vancouver not only are engaged in places like downtown Vancouver, but Lululemon began on the east side, began on Clark and Venables. And what happens when those small businesses have increasing costs when it comes towards commercial land values, and can they compete against this type of development scheme where you have the transformation of industrial land into residential? And I think that is, one of the important discussions in that the question isn't about how we live or what kinds of buildings we're going to live in, but it's what we're going to do. And what types of land and what types of land uses that we need to preserve to build the next Lululemon or the next Google.
Great. Go, yeah, Peter.
I just want to say something from the business perspective. When we started business in Vancouver in 1989, we were looking at the dearth of head offices in Vancouver, and it's still the case. I remember at that time we were thinking, Haig Ferris, a prominent entrepreneur here, was dreaming of how could we get $500 million companies in Vancouver? Well, we've nailed that one, but we are still, as the slide showed, a city of small businesses. And one of the biggest impediments of getting bigger businesses here, or better, growing the businesses we have here and keeping them here, is the difficulty of finding employees. And when the Vancouver Economic Commission did a study of employers and CEOs and asked them, what are your biggest barriers to expanding and retaining and improving your businesses? high cost of housing was right up there. So this is not just an issue of inequity among people renting and trying to just get their lives together and raise their families, but it's also a huge business issue and keeps people from getting those jobs that they wanted so badly in New Orleans, and keeps us in the, dare I say it, green zone of those charts where we were the lowest median incomes. And if somebody wants to talk about solutions to affordable housing, I have to get this one
That's
in.
another night.
Well, let's have another question. Okay. What?
Yeah. Okay. We're just hovering on the brink of like an explosion here, I can tell. And I'm going to make you the last one because we are a little bit over time, so you have the last question here.
Okay. I guess my question, part of, I think, our nervousness around the discussion around foreign investment in residential real estate is the idea that the solution is somehow to shut the door and exclude people. And perhaps the question shouldn't be that, but shouldn't it be how can we channel that incoming capital into useful endeavors? How can we channel that into investment in businesses that will employ people rather than passively to sit in real estate? And as a corollary, the huge increase that we've seen in residences over $3 million, and I note that in the first 8 months of this year, we had almost $2 billion in the Vancouver region, $2 billion in transactions of homes over $3 million. So we've got a huge issue there, but I'm concerned about the tax fairness here because almost all of that money is flowing into individuals. The money that is coming is largely attracted by what we have built, our education, our health care, all of these things. But it's flowing into the pockets of individuals, largely tax-free. And I wonder if there's any thought on the panel, and Andy, if you have any thought about tax fairness around this and how we might promote a better business investment climate for this incoming capital rather than passive real estate.
Okay. Thanks. And the light, this is a sign of how bad the light is. I didn't know it was you, Sandy Garasino, until you started speaking and I recognized your voice. I think maybe a number of people would like to tackle that question.
You got me just well, let me just say a couple things. I would just say one thing, I guess, in part response to you, Pete. It's something like, I would say, thank goodness this city the state of city of small businesses. I would say that's a first comment. And I would say that, not dissimilar to that, I would say that, and I guess this is going to be, I'm going to kind of slide it over to you, Andy, because I think you've spoken about it in lots of ways. Is I think it's a red herring to try to talk about where the capital is coming from per se. And I think that's what you're pointing to. I think that the fact of it is speculative capital. And Andy, I know you've used the idea of people who perceive this, that capital perceives this to be a safe place to park. People perceive this as a safe place to park their capital. And you've used this saying, well, let's just raise the parking fees. And I think that the idea of undercutting speculation is a welcome one, and I think it's one that many people have a large degree of comfortableness with, in part because it's so simple. The idea of a speculative tax, not unlike a capital gains tax, is extremely easy to imagine. It's extremely easy to implement. It's not a complicated set of ideas. It's whether or not we want to encourage or whether we want to discourage profiteering off of land. It's a simple ethical and a political question. It's not a functional or an economic question, in my view. But Andy, you've thought about this larger, so maybe I can let you answer that question.
And we're waiting for the map of which houses were bought by speculators, which houses were bought by people immigrating from China desperate to get away from the smog, and which houses were bought by third-generation Chinese people. We're waiting for that map.
Francis, I am too. But I think it's I always say that it's a complex question. That I think one, I think it's worth talking about, but it's actually one. I think it's one of those wicked little problems that isn't just about the city of Vancouver, but requires, I think, the participation of, just because of how we're set up as a country, that this is the new face of urbanism, of urban investment flows in the world, but yet we're set up as a colonial exporting country, that very little power actually is actually on the city level compared to the provincial and the federal levels. And that without the kind of participation of the provincial or federal levels of government, it's a big struggle. And I think that that's really one of the problems, is that we're actually, while we by numbers are a urban nation, by practice and by government, we're completely a exporting colony. When you look at really what sets up our entire governance system is actually something from 1867 as opposed to 2011. And I think it takes a certain amount of vision towards realizing that reality, that what are some of these new institutions we have to create, and the demand from citizens, from voters, to want those types of new institutions.
And I think also the data to back up what people are saying, because the numbers are as important as the stories, which is, what we saw some of tonight.
Share your slides.
Could I just, one data point we do have, Francis? We know who's a primary resident because we have homeowners grants. Mm-hmm. It's all on the tax rolls. We can divide the world up into people who are living in their homes and people who are not living in their homes, who are by nature necessarily some kind of speculators or second homeowners or investors. We can go from there and do some interesting things.
Okay, as I said, I think that's another night, because, the building here that I did a study on, 400 units in Woodwards, the primary investors were people from Metro Vancouver. Bought them and are renting them out to people in Vancouver. So, which I've had people suggest to me, I think it might have even been Sandy, this is the way the middle class, stuck in what feels like a situation where they can never get ahead, they're trying to get in on the speculative market because it's the only way they can sort of maintain their status. Anyway, you now have the topic for another night. We're going to wrap up here. I know people have lots more to say, but there is a reception afterwards that you're all invited to. It's not just for us up here at the front. So thank you very much for your questions and your attention. Thank you to all the panel members for some really thought-provoking ideas, responses. Thank you to Andy for an incredible amount of work and PowerPoint dexterity, and SFU for organizing this. Thank you.